and understanding. It's important to recognize these failures and also to recognize that it's never too late to overcome them. I mean, I'm misleading you by picking one factor, namely the role of the PLO leadership, which is far from the only factor, but it's the one that's sort of under control and the one that relates to the nature of Palestinian society, so that's the one I think that should concern you primarily. Well, there's going to be a continuing struggle over the long-term meaning of the Declaration of Principles. Even the subsequent agreements are somewhat open-ended, and what is written on paper is not graven in stone. There are plenty of opportunities to stimulate popular movements that will defend Palestinian and human political rights in the United States, which remains the most important case because of its enormous power, again, particularly in this region of the world. Such efforts in the Palestinian community could draw from and help stimulate similar forces in Israel, which have been politically marginalized, in part because of their lack of U.S. support. There's a lot of interactions here. There are also new opportunities for solidarity today. I don't really have time to talk about them, but I think they're important and should not be understated. These arise from processes that are underway throughout the world, a process that's usually called globalization. That's largely fraudulent, in my opinion. It's a pretty important topic that I don't have time to go into, but it has some elements of reality. The one thing that is being globalized is the structural model of third world societies. Any third world society you look at here, Central Africa, Asia, Latin America, pick the one you like, they all have the same structural properties. There are islands of great wealth and privilege within a huge mass of suffering and often misery, very sharply divided societies, typical third world pattern. That there's quite deliberate social policy in the last 20 years or so, which is instituting something similar in the rich societies as well. It's been well reported that the gap between the poor and the rich societies of the world has been growing for almost 40 years, but there's another fact that has been much less publicized, and that is that the gap between the richer and poorer sectors of the world's population, cutting across societies, that's been growing even faster. And this is a sign of the process that I'm talking about. These are large topics, but one consequence is that these developments are providing a new stimulus for international solidarity, and it's quite real. In fact, it's beginning to be visible, for example, in the U.S. labor movement. That's a new and significant development. It has not been true in the past that U.S. workers were, U.S. labor movement was supporting labor rights in other countries. In fact, quite the opposite was true until now. That's a very significant change, and it reflects the fact that there's a recognition of shared interests. In fact, what's beginning barely to happen, and I think is important, is that common material interests of poor and oppressed people, working people, are coming to interact with moral concerns. That's a powerful basis for international solidarity crossing national lines. I think Palestinians can be part of this rather promising development, but it's not going to come about by itself. It's going to take a serious, honest intellectual effort, just one component of continuing struggle. And for this to happen, I think the recommendations of Dr. Abdul Shafi and Azmi Bishara that I quoted earlier concerning the need of internal democracy should be taken very, very seriously. Thanks. Azmi?
Azmi,
How much time do we have?
Do you like to have all the questions together or not?
خليهم 2 3 بس اقول لهم انه في اسئله هلا.
The one thing you might do is just ask people not to make speeches.
شكرا للاستاذ شومسكي. اذا في ناس بيحبوا يطلعوا فيا ريت يطلعوا هلا، لانه في فتره اسئله واجوبه لمده ربع ساعه. If anybody wants to leave now, because we have 15 minutes for questions and answers.
قول لهم بيقدروا يسالوا السؤال بالعربي كمان، لانه هيك وقته يا.
إذا في حدا بحب يسأل سؤال بالعربي فممكن نحن نترجمه.
You created quite a stir.
I hope so. I like to. I don't know if it's a wise tactic or not, but I always try to tell people things that they're not going to want to hear, you know.
Please do. And now to give sort of comments and lectures and so on. So straight to the point, please. We will start.
If people can talk at the microphones, probably easier.
في هناك ميكروفونات 2 فاللي بيحب بيقدر يتقدم لهناك، او اذا كمان بدكم بدون ميكروفون برضه كمان بصير. Those who want to speak in the microphone, we have 2 here. So suit yourself. هاتوا لناخذ اول سؤال. The first question. You know, okay, this.
بتعرف ان وسائل التأثير على الرأي العام الأمريكي تعتمد كثير على الاقتصاد وعلى المال. فشو وسائل الضغط تملكها الشعوب الفقيرة عشان تأثر على الرأي العام الأمريكي؟
مين بيسأل؟ United States have power. بدك ترجم؟ أنا مظبوط ما انتبهتش في بداية السؤال.
Well, the question is that economics and finance play a big role in affecting policy. What kind of options does the third world have in influencing this kind?
In issues of finance and economics, poor third world countries have about as much power as poor people in the United States. But that's not the only factor that affects policy. It's a very unjust world, might as well face it. Every society, even the most democratic, is under the control of extremely powerful institutions, which in fact are totalitarian private tyrannies. But they are not free of public control. There are many ways for the public to influence developments. Actually, this case is a particularly interesting one. In the Middle East region, for U.S. policy, Middle East planning and strategy is very heavily influenced by the energy corporations. Not only because they're huge and they're basically part of the state apparatus, they're not private corporations, but also because they have a special interest in the Middle East. So you'd expect that their policies would prevail. Well, one rather interesting fact about the past 25 years is that they have lost. They have been in favor of the international consensus. So if the, Aramco, let's say, had been able to decide U.S. policy, they would have accepted Sadat's offer in 1971, and they would have voted for the UN declaration in 1976, and the thing would have been over. There would have been a 2-state settlement, pretty ugly settlement in my opinion, but whatever you think about it, it would have happened 20 years ago, 25 years ago. Well, they lost because there's a balance of forces. There are other strong interests. There's the whole a large part of advanced industry, high technology industry, depends on the military system and is closely linked to it, and they have important interests, and their conception of running this region is to do it by force, not by negotiations, and they won. Probably they won in the internal conflict, if you look closely, because of public opinion. I think that was the decisive difference. It was sort of balanced. And in fact, the public arena was overwhelmingly run by strong advocates of Israeli power and violence. A lot of them liberal intellectuals, I should say. The kind of people who, that's no joke, the people who write it in newspapers and journals. Now, those are not people with any great influence, you know. I mean, if policy goes in another direction, they follow it. They're not going to stand out against power. Power goes one way, they're within an inch of it. But in this case, there was a conflict, and their attitude happened to be on one side, and that meant that only one point of view was ever heard. And that enabled, I think that's probably what enabled Kissinger to win out in his struggle against the State Department. It could have gone the other way. So there are lots of interests, and public opinion has an enormous effect, particularly in cases like this. In cases where the whole of the financial and economic system is on one side, it's going to be much harder for public opinion to influence things, although even there it does. One should not underestimate the fact that in any society, I mean even a totalitarian society, and certainly a more free and democratic society, currents of public opinion and public activism and pressures and so on can make a very great difference. The cases I mentioned are illustrations, and there are many others.
Mr. Chomsky, regarding your talk about these opportunities for the Palestinians to garner international support, could you at least give us one example of such opportunities, and then your opinion as to the likelihood of the Palestinian leadership seizing upon these opportunities given its current state?
Opportunities at the present or in the past?
Either
Present. Well, you know, if the Palestinian leadership were to come to the United States and say, look, we are what we in fact are, conservative nationalists. We're not revolutionaries, which they never were. We would like to elect our own mayors, you know. We would like to run our own affairs. We don't want foreign armies that you're paying for to come and beat us up and break up our, you know, keep us from traveling where we like and so on and so forth. And besides, we don't think that you ought to be paying billions of dollars. You ought to be giving more subsidies to Israel than you give to any state in the Union. If they were to come with that picture, I think they would have overwhelming support right now. And in fact, that picture is more or less accurate. Well, they've chosen not to do that. It could be done right now.
And the likelihood?
The likelihood? I don't know. The likelihood comes from Palestinian society. I can't judge about that. The likelihood of the effect? I don't know. It wouldn't be easy. You know, I don't want to, again, let me stress, this is only one factor. There are a lot of others. So it would take a lot of work to develop these things. On the other hand, as compared with other causes of this kind, the Palestinian one seems to me a particularly promising one. There have been others that have been much, much harder, where you were really struggling against mainstream U.S. government policy with big power interests behind it. And that was much harder, but it sometimes worked. In this case, I think it wouldn't be that hard.
If you were to look back at your book on the sacred triangle, Palestinian, Israeli, United States, would you still hold the same conclusions, or you change the triangle to some other direction? To square.
Square. It's the same triangle. I mean, you know, things are, that was 1983, and things are different now than in 1983, so yeah, changed some things. But the story is basically the same. It's a triangular relationship. Israel and the Palestinians are in confrontation in this region, and the United States runs the region. In fact, it runs it much more today than it did 20 years ago. Not because of the Russians, incidentally. That was always an illusion. In fact, it's always been evident from internal U.S. documents that they regarded the Soviet Union as a kind of a marginal element in Middle Eastern affairs. And in fact, that's now officially recognized. So after the fall of the Berlin Wall, when you didn't make any sense to pretend any longer, the Bush administration officially came out with the statement that in a policy planning document that in the middle, that we have to maintain our intervention forces aimed at the Middle East, okay, have to maintain them, now I'm quoting, where the threats to our interests could not be laid at the Kremlin's door. Okay, so in other words, it was lies all of these years, and there's no use persisting with them because the Russians are gone, so now let's tell the truth. The truth is that the threats to our interests were indigenous nationalism. The threats to our interests were quite simple, in fact. The U.S. policy toward the Middle East is based on the principle that the enormous wealth of this region has to flow to U.S. investors and the U.S. Treasury Department and so on, not to the people of the region. Okay, so like not to the people in the slums of Cairo, say. They don't get anything from this wealth. And people in the region sometimes get funny ideas. They don't understand why the wealth of their region has to go to rich people somewhere else. There's a name for that. It's called radical nationalism. Radical nationalism is the funny idea that people have all over the world that they ought to benefit from their own resources. And that has to be beaten out of their heads by force. And that takes violence, not just here. And the relation of Israel and the United States developed in that context. I mean, the British had set up a system. When the British ran this region, they set up a system which was like this. They said they realized that, and during the First World War, Britain realized it didn't have the power to run the region directly by force. And besides, it wasn't cost effective, cost them money. So they decided it should be run by local managers, which they called an Arab facade. And this is secret documents. You don't say things like this in public, but now it's public. So the oil-producing regions should be run by an Arab facade, but the British would continue to rule behind the veil of, dependencies and this and that, and so call them states and so on. Now, the Arab facade has to be weak and dependent, right? It has to do its job. It has to make sure that the wealth goes to the West. It's allowed to enrich itself. That's part of the third world model. But most of the wealth has to go to the West. Since the Arab facade has to be dependable, it has to be weak, so family dictatorships are the favored choice. But then they have to be protected from all of these strange people who get these funny ideas, the radical nationalists, and that requires local policemen with U.S. and British muscle in reserve in case it's needed. The local policemen in this region have been typically non-Arab. So there's Turkey, Iran under the Shah, Israel, Pakistan, which provided a kind of a Praetorian guard for the Saudi royal family, and so on and so forth. Apparently the idea is that non-Arabs find it easier to kick Arabs in the face than Arabs do. I guess that's the reasoning. Anyway, the local gendarmes are non-Arabs, mostly. And if they can't handle it, the U.S. and Britain step into it themselves, the big guys. Well, that's the basic picture, okay? And the relations between the U.S. and Israel grew and developed in that structure. So it remains. But there are other ways of controlling the region, for example, by diplomatic and political settlement, which is what the oil companies themselves always wanted. And the U.S. could easily shift to that.
We will take two more questions.
Professor Chomsky, I highly appreciated your presentation. It was so candid, frank, and with a good scientific analysis.
It's not a good scientific microphone.
I refer to international solidarity. You mentioned that you correctly stressed on the importance of this kind of solidarity. But as you know, that international solidarity gives fruit within 10 to 20 years. It doesn't give fruit within 2 years, 1 or 2 years. And in the United States, the dominant politics is politics of power, politics of people who dominate the big companies and the main parts of power, And in this in this society, your committee, the committee in which you are, the Jewish Committee for Middle East Peace, works very well towards supporting the peace, negotiated peace and justice. But I wonder, I follow up your activities, but I wonder whether you have two committees, one with the 250 prominent, outstanding Jewish scholars and academicians, and one with Mr. Mark Brzezinski, the secretary, whose task is only to attack Arab regimes, mainly Saudi Arabia. And as you mentioned correctly, that the Middle East is dominated by politics of energy, politics of weapons, etc. And that there is place, the Palestinians can't themselves follow up the advices of Mr. Brzezinski. So what could you help us in this sense in America, in such an environment which is dominant in the Middle East and which is dominant locally by the APEC? What could your committee do?
Well, first of all, this I happen to be a member of that committee, but it's so marginal in importance that it's the kind of committee that consists of half a dozen people who sign a petition now and then. It's one of those things. It doesn't have any role in anything. I mean, it's of whatever use it is, but it's not significant. Much more significant is the fact that if a meeting is called, like for example, a few weeks ago, a meeting was called in Boston without even a speaker. Al Sarraj was there, and he and I spoke at a meeting. We had about 800 people, I guess, who showed up just because they were interested and excited and wanted to hear something about it and so on. That happens all over the place, and there are people organizing and trying to do something about it. And they've had a hard time. A lot of it's our fault. I mean, I have talked about things that are somebody else's fault, but as I said, everybody's got to think about what went wrong. You're quite right in saying that the politics of the region are governed by power, but that's not just the United States. That's also everybody else, down to Honduras. Looks more dramatic in the case of the United States because they have a lot more power, So therefore, U.S. power makes a much bigger difference than, Honduran power. But that's the way states work. It's by no means insuperable. Let me say again, in this particular region, it's a rather dramatic fact that the major centers of private power are against state policy and in favor of a political settlement, and have been for 30 years, and they have lost. Okay? That's just one of many indications of what I think is true, that this is one that would have been easy to win as compared with others that are much harder to win. As for it taking 20 or 30 years, well, sometimes, but not always. There have been very big changes in the United States in the past 30 years. It sort of began in the 1960s, and it sort of developed since. And one effect is a much warmer reception to solidarity movements. So take, say, Central America, which the movement developed almost overnight. Didn't take 20 years. The Reagan administration made some threats, really, indications that it might want to move to military intervention in Central America, very much the way John F. Kennedy had done it.
I'm Mark Brzezinski, your host for this weekly program, Mideast Realities, and thank you for watching. If you too are concerned about the situation in today's Middle East and about U.S. policies toward that crucial region of the world, and if you'd like to meet like-minded persons, why don't you come to one of our weekly social meetings? I'll be there, of course. Just give us a call for details.